At 6:30 this morning, my credit card was declined for a $3.38 cup of black coffee. When I called my son to see if the bank made an error, his wife answered the phone laughing. She told me my accounts were frozen, that I was too old to handle my own money, and that from now on I needed to beg them for an allowance. I did not argue. I did not yell. I just hung up, tipped the barista with my last $5 bill, and drove straight to the bank. 3 hours later, I walked out to my truck and looked at my phone. 64 missed calls from my son. Before I tell you how I dismantled his entire life by lunch, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind an arrogant child exactly who built the empire they are standing on. I am George Bennett. I am 70 years old. I spent 40 years of my life turning a single rusty delivery truck into one of the largest logistics fleets in the Midwest. My hands are rough. My boots are scuffed from decades of walking warehouse floors. I live in the same modest 3-bedroom house I bought with my late wife Barbara 30 years ago. I do not wear expensive tailored suits, and I still prefer the dark roast drip coffee from the local drive-thru over anything fancy. My son Stephen and his wife Amanda mistook my quiet retirement for weakness. They mistook my grief over losing Barbara for senile decay. The cashier at the drive-thru window looked at me with deep, sympathetic eyes. She swiped the plastic card through the reader for a third time. The terminal beeped a sharp final sound. "I am so sorry, Mr. Bennett," she whispered, holding the card back out to me through the window. "The screen says restricted. Please contact your financial institution." I felt the heat rise in my neck, a brief flush of humiliation that burned my skin. I handed her a crumpled $5 bill from my dashboard, told her to keep the change, and pulled my truck into the empty parking lot next door. I put the truck in park and dialed Stephen. He was supposed to be managing the regional accounts while I stepped back to enjoy my golden years. The line clicked open. Stephen did not say hello. He did not ask how my morning was. He just let out a long, rehearsed sigh of exhaustion. "Dad, we were going to tell you this afternoon. We canceled your cards." My grip tightened on the worn leather steering wheel. Canceled. By whose authority? Before Stephen could answer, Amanda's voice cut through the speakerphone. Her tone was dripping with that fake, sugary concern she always used when she was about to do something completely vicious. "George, we had to do it. You bought a new lawnmower last week without asking us. You are getting forgetful. You are simply too old to be managing finances anymore. We are putting you on a fixed allowance. Ask us before you spend a dime." The sheer audacity of it hung in the cold morning air. The logistics company generates millions in quarterly revenue. The bank accounts hold the capital of my entire life's work. I had let Stephen step in as acting director to learn the ropes to prepare him for the future. I gave him access to facilitate payroll and vendor contracts so he could learn the value of hard work. I never gave him the keys to the kingdom. Stephen chimed back in his voice thick with unearned authority. "It is for your own good, Dad. I am taking over the primary estate. We will bring you some cash on Sunday for groceries. Just stay home today and rest." They expected me to rage. They expected an old man to yell at the clouds, to throw a tantrum that they could record and use as proof of my supposed mental decline. I looked at my calloused hands gripping the steering wheel. I remembered the nights I slept in the cab of my first truck to ensure deliveries made it on time so Stephen could go to a prestigious private school. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a single word of argument or defense. I just ended the call. I put the truck in drive. I did not go home. I turned onto the highway and headed straight for the main corporate branch of the bank downtown. I knew my personal accounts were not just frozen due to some simple banking error. They were actively being hijacked. The heavy glass doors of the bank parted as I bypassed the teller line entirely and walked directly into the office of the branch manager, Bruce. He stood up immediately, looking pale and deeply uncomfortable. "George," he stammered, frantically adjusting his tie. "I was just about to call you. I am legally obligated to inform you that your son was here an hour ago." I sat down in the leather chair across from his desk. "Show me exactly what he gave you, Bruce." Bruce opened a drawer and slid a thick folder across the mahogany desk. "Stephen submitted a full power of attorney this morning. Along with it, he filed a medical evaluation, declaring you mentally incompetent, stating you have advanced rapid-onset dementia and require immediate financial receivership." I opened the folder. The power of attorney document looked official, stamped and notarized, but the signature at the bottom was a flawless forgery. Stephen had spent years watching me sign logistics contracts. He had practiced my handwriting perfectly. I flipped to the medical evaluation. I did not recognize the clinic letterhead at first, but then the address clicked in my mind. It was not from my primary care physician. It was the shady wellness spa Amanda frequented for her cosmetic injections, a place known for writing whatever prescriptions their wealthy clients paid for in cash. I looked up at Bruce. My voice was dangerously calm. "Bruce, look me in the eye. Do I look like a man with advanced dementia?" Bruce wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "No, George. You are as sharp as you have always been, but the documents look legitimate on paper. Our legal department is reviewing them right now. And George, there is something else. Stephen is currently attempting to push through a massive wire transfer. He is trying to drain the primary corporate holding account into an offshore limited liability company. I was not just stealing my personal checking account. He was trying to liquidate the entire logistics empire I spent 4 decades building. He wanted to leave me with absolutely nothing, stripping the company bare and running off with the capital." Bruce turned his monitor so I could see the screen. "The wire is pending in our system. Because of the power of attorney he filed, the system recognized his executive credentials. The transfer is scheduled to clear in exactly 15 minutes. I leaned forward. Stephen was arrogant, but he was also sloppy. He forgot one crucial detail about the corporate banking infrastructure I set up 20 years ago. He thought the paperwork was the final authority. He forgot about the founder's biometric override. "Bruce," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "Initiate a biometric lockdown, Tier 1. Bruce's eyes widened in shock. He scrambled to his keyboard. "George, if I do that, it overrides everything. It invalidates all secondary executive credentials immediately. It freezes the entire board out." "Do it," I commanded. I stood up and placed my right thumb on the digital scanner resting on the corner of his desk. The machine beeped, flashing a solid green light. The screen on Bruce's desk refreshed instantly. The pending wire transfer vanished, replaced by a glaring red error message reading, "Unauthorized access." I sat back in the chair and accepted a complimentary bottle of water from Bruce's assistant. For the next 3 hours, I did not leave that office. I watched the live system feed on the large monitor mounted on the wall. The counterattack was completely silent, but utterly devastating. First, I revoked Stephen's executive banking privileges. His access to the corporate funds was instantly terminated. Then I targeted Amanda. I pulled up the corporate black cards she had been treating as her personal piggy bank. "Cancel them all," I told Bruce. "Report them as stolen." Next, I authorized the immediate transfer of all liquid assets, both personal and corporate, into a secure blind trust. Only I had the biometric key to access it. Stephen's forged power of attorney was now a useless piece of paper governing completely empty accounts. Then the real show began. It was the first of the month. I sat quietly and watched as Stephen's automated luxury payments attempted to process. The system flashed red over and over again. Insufficient funds. The auto draft for his imported sports car bounced. The payment for his private country club membership bounced. The massive mortgage payment for his sprawling gated mansion bounced in real time. Bruce watched the screen, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. "George," he murmured, "they are going to notice this immediately." That is exactly the point, I replied. I finished my water, crushed the plastic bottle, and stood up. I shook Bruce's hand, thanking him for his diligence. I walked out of the bank, the heavy glass doors closing behind me, sealing my son's financial fate. The morning sun was fully up now, warming the asphalt of the parking lot. I walked over to my old pickup truck and pulled my phone out of my pocket. The screen was illuminated with a flood of notifications. 64 missed calls from Stephen. 27 frantic text messages from Amanda. Dad, why is my card declining? George, call us back right now. This is not funny. Dad, the bank says I am locked out. What did you do? Fix this right now. The financial bloodline had been severed. They had tried to cut me off from a $3 coffee. In response, I had cut them off from millions. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and started the engine. I knew they would not just accept defeat. Desperate people do desperate things, and Stephen had just realized he was completely broke. I pulled into my driveway an hour later. The quiet suburban street was usually peaceful, but today a pristine white van was parked aggressively across my front walk. Stephen and Amanda were standing on my porch. Next to them stood a burly man in a cheap suit, holding a clipboard, wearing a lanyard that identified him as a private medical transport agent. A fake social worker hired to do their dirty work. I parked the truck and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots. Amanda saw me first. Her face was flushed, her designer makeup slightly smudged from absolute panic. George, she screamed, marching down the steps. You ruined our morning. My card was declined at the salon in front of everyone. Turn the accounts back on right now. Stephen stepped forward, his posture highly aggressive. He looked terrified and furious all at once. Dad, I do not know what kind of stunt you pulled at the bank, but the games are over. Give me your truck keys. You are clearly having a severe mental break. He gestured to the large man in the cheap suit. This gentleman is here to escort you to a specialized care facility. We have the paperwork. You are going whether you walk to the van or we carry you. They were trying to physically remove me from my own property. They wanted to lock me in a low-end ward and throw away the key so they could loot my house in peace. The sheer cruelty of their plan crystallized in the morning air. They had brought muscle to intimidate an old man. I did not flinch. I walked straight toward them. Stephen puffed up his chest, preparing for a physical altercation. I simply sidestepped him with the fluid grace of a man who spent decades hauling heavy freight. I walked up my porch steps, pulled my house key from my pocket, and unlocked my front door. Before I stepped inside, I turned back to my son. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out a sleek, embossed business card. I flicked it through the air. It landed on the porch floor right at Stephen's feet. Call him, I said, my voice perfectly level and cold. Michael Sullivan. He is a criminal defense lawyer. You are going to need him when the fraud division finishes reviewing that power of attorney document you forged. Stephen looked down at the card, the color draining completely from his face. Amanda let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. I stepped inside and shut the heavy oak door, locking the deadbolt with a solid, satisfying click. Through the front window, I watched Stephen scramble to pick up the card. The fake social worker quickly marched up to my door, slapped a piece of paper against the glass, secured it with a thick strip of tape, and retreated to the van. I watched them drive away, their tires squealing in pure panic. I walked over and looked at the paper taped to my front door. It was a court summons for an emergency competency hearing. They were going to try to use the legal system to strip away my human rights. They thought they could still win in a courtroom. They had no idea what was coming next. Michael Sullivan did not offer me a comforting cup of coffee when I walked into his downtown office. He did not offer empty sympathies about the betrayal of a child or waste time with pleasantries. He simply extended his hand, took summons my son had taped to my front door, and adjusted his reading glasses. His office was a reflection of the man himself. It was cold, structured, and completely devoid of anything that did not serve a distinct tactical purpose. I sat across from him in silence as his sharp eyes tracked across the legal document. I had paid handsomely for his reputation. Sullivan was a corporate litigator known for dismantling hostile takeovers with absolute prejudice. Right now, the hostile takeover was happening inside my own family. "This is a standard emergency guardianship petition," Sullivan said, his voice flat and remarkably steady. "Your son is claiming you are suffering from a rapid cognitive decline. He is asking the court to grant him immediate and total control over your medical decisions and your financial estate. He has included the forged medical evaluation you mentioned, along with a sworn affidavit from his wife detailing your supposed erratic and dangerous behavior." Sullivan dropped the thick stack of paper onto his polished desk. "It is a bold, calculated move, George. He is banking on you being too slow, too heartbroken, or too intimidated to fight back before the judge grants the temporary order. But he made a fatal error. He assumed you would sit in your living room and cry. He assumed you would not seek aggressive legal counsel within 24 hours. I told Sullivan about the biometric lockdown I had initiated at the bank just hours prior. I reached into my jacket and handed over an encrypted flash drive containing the raw transactional data from the final 30 days of Stephen acting as the corporate director. Sullivan plugged the drive into his secure terminal. His team of forensic accountants had been on standby since my initial phone call. Within minutes, the sterile silence of the room was broken by the rapid clicking of a keyboard. Sullivan was meticulously piecing together the financial blood trail my son had desperately tried to conceal beneath layers of corporate jargon. "Stephen is not just arrogant, George. He is utterly terrified." Sullivan turned his large monitor toward me. He brought up a complex series of nested shell corporations and pending offshore wire attempts. "Your son did not freeze your personal accounts out of simple greed. He did it out of pure, unadulterated desperation. He has been bleeding your corporate reserves dry for months." Sullivan pointed to a massive column of diverted funds highlighted in red on the screen. $2 million was siphoned into a commercial real estate holding account. That specific account is the sole guarantor for a luxury boutique in the Arts District. A boutique registered entirely in Amanda's name. It has not turned a single dollar of profit in 3 years. Stephen has been secretly using your legacy to fund his wife's failing vanity project to keep up their wealthy facade. But vanity was the least of my son's sins. Sullivan clicked another folder, pulling up a second, significantly darker financial web. The corporate accounts showed heavy, highly irregular cash withdrawals. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been liquidated and moved through untraceable third-party payment processors. Stephen has leveraged company assets to cover massive illicit debts. Sullivan explained, his tone growing grim. These are not standard business loans or bad stock market investments. The routing numbers trace back to known fronts for an underground syndicate operating out of the eastern seaboard. Illegal sports gambling, most likely, or high-interest shadow loans. He is drowning in debt to people who do not send polite collection letters in the mail. They send enforcers. Stephen tried to steal your entire empire this morning because if he does not pay these violent people back by the end of the week, he is going to lose much more than his mansion. The weight of the betrayal settled deep in my chest like a block of lead. My son had not just stolen my money. He had weaponized the company I built from nothing. He was risking the livelihood of 300 loyal employees to cover his own reckless criminal behavior. He was willing to lock his own father in a psychiatric ward just to save his own skin from the mob. I did not feel sorrow. I felt a cold, absolute resolve hardening my spine. "We need to present this data to the judge immediately," I said, my voice echoing evenly in the quiet room. "We crushed the guardianship petition today, and we have him arrested for grand embezzlement." Sullivan shook his head slowly, leaning back in his leather executive chair. "It is not that simple, George. Digital records can be fiercely contested in a courtroom. Stephen has expensive lawyers. They will argue that the corporate accounts were hacked by a third party. They might even argue that you authorized those transfers yourself, in a state of mental confusion, using the very dementia diagnosis they fabricated against you. They will tie this up in litigation and delay the proceedings for months. By the time the absolute truth comes out, the syndicate will have bled the company dry, or Stephen will have fled the country. We need undeniable physical proof. We need the shadow ledgers. I knew exactly what Sullivan meant. During my entire tenure as chief executive officer, I insisted on physical handwritten ledgers for all high-level executive expenditures. It was an old-school habit, a physical fail-safe against digital corruption or server failures. Stephen had constantly mocked me for it, calling me a dinosaur, but he was legally forced to maintain the practice to keep his position. He kept the current physical ledgers locked in the master safe inside the executive suite at the company headquarters. Those bound books would show his actual handwritten signatures, authorizing the illicit payouts to Amanda's boutique and the shadow creditors. Those books were the final nail in his coffin. Then I will go to headquarters right now, demand entry, and pull the ledgers from the safe myself, I stated, standing up from my chair with renewed purpose. But Sullivan held up a hand, stopping me in my tracks. He pulled another crisp sheet of paper from the bottom of Stephen's legal pile. "You cannot go anywhere near that building, George." Sullivan slid the paper across the desk. Attached to the guardianship petition is an emergency temporary restraining order. Stephen convinced a sympathetic judge that you are dangerously erratic, violent, and pose a physical threat to the corporate staff. If you step 1 foot onto company property, the police will arrest you on the spot for violating a court order. It will give Stephen the exact documented proof he needs to validate his claims of your insanity. I stared down at the legal injunction. My own son had legally barred me from the very empire I built with my bare hands. The foundation of that building was poured using the sweat of my youth, yet I was banished from it. He had built a fortress of lies around my legacy, and he was using the law as a shield to protect his crimes. The physical ledgers were sitting less than 10 miles away, locked in a safe I purchased inside an office I designed. But the moment I touched the front glass doors, I would be walking straight into Stephen's trap. "We cannot use a subpoena to get them," Sullivan warned, his eyes locked on mine. "The moment Stephen gets a formal legal request for those physical books, he will throw them in a warehouse incinerator and claim they were lost in a fire. We need those ledgers secured before he even realizes we know they exist." I walked over to the large window overlooking the city skyline. I thought about the hundreds of men and women working on my warehouse floors right now, trusting me to keep their families fed and their health insurance active. I could not let my entitled son destroy their lives to pay his gambling debts. I could not cross the property line. Sullivan could not cross the property line. I needed someone already inside the fortress. I needed someone completely invisible to Stephen's arrogance. Someone fiercely loyal to the true founder of the company. I turned back to Sullivan, my mind locking onto a target. "Draft the counterfiling," I told him. "I know exactly how we get those books out of that building." I left Michael Sullivan sitting in his sterile office and walked out to the concrete parking garage. I sat in the cab of my truck and stared at the worn steering wheel. The silence of the vehicle pressed heavily against my chest. Stephen had locked me out of my own building with a piece of paper signed by a judge. He thought he had cut off all my avenues of attack because he only understood the world in terms of legal threats, corporate bylaws, and intimidation. He did not understand the one currency that actually kept the logistics industry running: loyalty. Stephen viewed the warehouse staff, the drivers, and the office workers as replaceable numbers on a spreadsheet. He treated them as liabilities instead of human beings. When he took over as acting director, his very first executive move was to demote Beverly. Beverly had been my head of payroll for 28 years. She knew the name of every driver and the birthdays of their children. Stephen moved her to a windowless basement office, claiming she was too old to understand the new software integration, slashing her pension contributions and cutting her salary in the process. He did not know that 20 years ago, Beverly was a single mother, working 2 shifts just to keep the heat on in her apartment. when her bright, hard-working daughter was accepted into a prestigious state university. Beverly was preparing to sell her modest home to pay the tuition. I found out about it from a warehouse foreman. I walked into her office the next morning and handed her a certified check from my personal account that covered all 4 years of tuition, room, and board. I told her to put her house keys away and pay me back by making sure my drivers always got their checks on time. She never missed a single Friday in 2 decades. I pulled out my phone and dialed her direct extension. I prayed Stephen had not monitored her phone lines yet. It rang twice before she answered. George, her voice was a hushed, frantic whisper. I saw the company-wide email Stephen sent out this morning. He told everyone you had a severe mental breakdown and that security was instructed to call the police immediately if you showed up on the property. I leaned back against the headrest, keeping my voice perfectly calm. Beverly, I am perfectly fine, but I need your help. I need the physical ledger books from the master safe in the executive suite. There was a heavy silence on the line. I knew I was asking her to risk her livelihood. Then she spoke with absolute steel. He changed the keypad code last week, George, but he is careless and arrogant. He left the master override key taped under the bottom drawer of his desk because he cannot be bothered to remember the combination. How do you want them delivered? I told her to meet me at the old diner parking lot, 2 miles off the interstate, at 3 o'clock, right when the afternoon shift change happened. I warned her of the immense risk. If Stephen caught her, he would ruin her financially and press charges for corporate theft. Beverly simply told me she was already packing up her desk anyway. 2 hours later, I sat in my truck in the back corner of the diner parking lot. The afternoon sun beat down on the cracked asphalt. Michael Sullivan pulled up next to me in his black sedan. He had insisted on taking custody of the ledgers the exact moment they were secured to maintain a pristine legal chain of evidence. We waited in silence, watching the highway exit ramp. At exactly 3:10, Beverly pulled into the lot in her old blue sedan. She parked next to my truck and popped her trunk. I stepped out to meet her. She reached into the back and pulled out a heavy plastic recycling bin. Hidden beneath the thick stack of shredded paper and empty coffee cups were 3 heavy leather-bound ledger books. She handed them to me. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her eyes were fierce and unblinking. I was in his office screaming at a vendor on the phone, she said, catching her breath. I slipped in through the adjoining supply closet, opened the safe while his back was turned, dropped the books in the recycling bin, and walked right past the security desk. Nobody looks twice at the old, demoted woman taking out the trash. I took the heavy books and looked at her. Thank you, Beverly. You did not have to risk a prison sentence for me. She reached out and squeezed my rough hand. My daughter just made partner at her law firm last week, George. She specializes in corporate defense. We do not forget who built the bridge we walked on. Take your company back. Beverly got back into her car and drove away. I walked over to the black sedan and handed the ledgers to Sullivan through the passenger window. He unlocked his doors, and I slid into the passenger seat beside him. He placed the heavy books on his center console, opened the most recent volume, and ran his finger down the columns of handwritten blue ink entries. Stephen was legally forced to keep these physical records to satisfy the strict internal audit requirements I established decades ago. Sullivan pulled out a small magnifying glass and cross-referenced the handwritten payouts with the digital wire transfers he had pulled from the flash drive earlier. The silence in the car grew incredibly heavy. The distant hum of the highway traffic faded away. I watched the color slowly drain from my lawyer's face. Sullivan was a man who handled corporate espionage, hostile takeovers, and vicious boardroom brawls every single day. Almost nothing shocked him. But right now his hands were completely rigid. "George, lock the door," Sullivan commanded, his voice suddenly stripped of all its usual corporate polish. I pressed the lock button. He turned the heavy ledger toward me and pointed to a recurring sequence of massive numbers carefully logged in Stephen's distinct handwriting. "I thought he was just siphoning cash to pay off shadow loans," Sullivan said, tapping the page with his pen. I thought he was just an idiot funding his wife's boutique and covering his gambling debts. But look at the disbursement ratios. Look at the shipping manifests tied to these dollar amounts. He is not just paying a debt to the underground creditors. He is receiving massive unexplained cash deposits from overseas shell companies. Sullivan flipped the page, pointing to a corresponding list of freight movements. He is logging those cash deposits as fictitious freight invoices. He is booking empty trucks to drive across state lines to generate fake shipping manifests, validating the incoming cash. Then he is wiring that clean-washed money back out to shady commercial construction firms on the East Coast. I stared at the numbers. The reality of the math hitting me like a physical blow to the chest. He was taking dirty street money, filtering it through my clean decades-old logistics contracts, and sending it back out completely washed. He was using the pristine reputation of my company as a giant washing machine for organized crime. He is not just a degenerate gambler in debt to the mob. I said, the crushing gravity of the situation settling over us in the cramped car. Sullivan closed the ledger, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. No, George. Your son is acting as a primary money launderer for a massive regional crime syndicate. If the federal authorities audit this company and find these ledgers before we go to the authorities ourselves, they will not just arrest Stephen. They will seize your entire corporate empire under federal racketeering laws. Every truck, every warehouse, and every bank account will be frozen and confiscated permanently. We do not just have a family dispute anymore. We have a federal emergency. The heavy oak doors of the county courthouse felt cold against my palm as I pushed them open. I walked into the courtroom alongside my lawyer, Michael Sullivan. The air inside was thick and formal, smelling of floor wax and old paper. Stephen and Amanda were already seated at the petitioner table. They had clearly coordinated their outfits for maximum sympathy. Amanda wore a modest beige dress, with her hair tied back, completely lacking the flashy designer accessories she usually flaunted. Stephen wore a plain dark suit, slumping his shoulders to look like an exhausted, heartbroken son. They were treating a legal proceeding to strip away my human rights like an audition for a daytime television drama. I took my seat next to Sullivan at the defense table. I did not look at my son. I rested my rough hands on the polished wood and stared straight ahead at the bench. Sullivan had warned me earlier that morning. He told me that family court judges watch the accused very closely during competency hearings. Any sign of anger, any sudden outburst, or any display of bitterness could be interpreted as erratic behavior. My only job today was to be an absolute pillar of stone. I had to let Stephen and Amanda hang themselves with their own rope. Judge Reynolds entered the courtroom and called the hearing to order. She was a stern woman with sharp eyes who looked like she had zero tolerance for nonsense. Stephen had hired a slick, expensive lawyer who immediately stood up and began painting a deeply tragic picture. He spoke in soft, somber tones about the painful reality of aging. He told the judge that my cognitive decline had been rapid and devastating. He claimed I was a danger to myself and to the public. To seal their fabricated tragedy, Amanda took the witness stand. She raised her right hand and swore an oath to tell the truth, then immediately launched into a sickening performance. She produced real tears, wiping her eyes with a tissue as she looked at the judge. She recounted a completely fictional story about finding me wandering the neighborhood in my pajamas at 3 a.m, supposedly looking for my late wife, Barbara. Her voice broke perfectly as she described how she had to gently guide me back home. Then she told a harrowing lie about how I had left the gas stove running all night, nearly blowing up the house. She looked at me with fake pity and told the court that it was breaking their hearts, but they had to take away my independence to save my life. I sat in absolute silence. I did not shake my head. I did not scoff. I kept my breathing slow and measured, maintaining eye contact with the judge. I knew that my silence was unnerving Stephen. He kept glancing over at me, waiting for the explosion of temper he had tried so hard to provoke. When Amanda finally stepped down, wiping away her crocodile tears, Sullivan stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket and approached the bench. He did not raise his voice. He did not sound dramatic. He sounded like a surgeon preparing to cut out a tumor. Your Honor, Sullivan began handing a thick stack of sealed, watermarked envelopes to the bailiff to pass to the judge. The petitioners have presented a very moving narrative today. However, we prefer to rely on actual medical science rather than amateur theater. Sullivan explained that over the past 48 hours, I had voluntarily subjected myself to rigorous, comprehensive cognitive and psychological evaluations. I did not go to a single doctor. I sat with 3 independent board-certified neurologists who were considered the top experts in the state. Sullivan informed the judge that all 3 medical professionals concluded my brain function was exceptionally sharp. They unanimously certified that I showed absolutely 0 signs of dementia, memory loss, or cognitive impairment. The slick lawyer representing my son shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Stephen stared at the back of Sullivan with growing panic. But Sullivan was not finished. He turned his attention to the medical evaluation Stephen had submitted with the original petition. Your Honor, I would like to direct the court to the letterhead on the petitioner's medical document, Sullivan said, his voice ringing with cold authority. The physician who signed that declaration of advanced dementia does not practice neurology. In fact, he operates a private wellness and cosmetic spa in the Arts District. A spa that financial records show the petitioner's wife visits bi-weekly for cosmetic injections. Amanda turned ghost white. She grabbed Stephen by the sleeve under the table. The judge put on her reading glasses and examined the document. Stephen had submitted, her expression darkening with every passing second. To conclude, Sullivan said, placing one final piece of paper on the judge's desk, we have submitted a sworn affidavit from an independent forensic handwriting analyst. They examined the power of attorney document the petitioner used to freeze my client's assets. The analyst conclusively determined that the signature belonging to George Bennett is a total and complete forgery. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a devastating storm. Stephen looked at his expensive lawyer, expecting him to object or argue, but his lawyer was furiously packing his briefcase. This man realized he had been handed forged documents and was one step away from being disbarred for presenting them in a court of law. He was abandoning the sinking ship immediately. Judge Reynolds took off her glasses and looked down at Stephen and Amanda. Her eyes were filled with absolute, unfiltered disgust. I have presided over family court for 20 years, she said, her voice dripping with contempt. I have seen children make difficult choices for sick parents. But what I am looking at today is not a difficult choice. It is a predatory, calculated, and malicious attempt to strip a perfectly healthy man of his civil rights for financial gain. She picked up her wooden gavel. This petition for emergency guardianship is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I am forwarding these forged medical and legal documents directly to the district attorney for an immediate fraud investigation. You should both consider retaining criminal defense counsel by the end of the day. The gavel slammed down like a gunshot. The sound echoed off the high ceiling. It was completely. They had tried to lock me away, and instead they had handed a judge the exact evidence needed to launch a criminal probe against them. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Sullivan walked beside me, his face calm and satisfied. We stepped out into the wide marble hallway of the courthouse. The air was much cooler out here. Before we could reach the elevators, heavy footsteps echoed behind us. Stephen marched out of the heavy oak doors, his face flushed red with unadulterated fury. Amanda trailed behind him, looking terrified and small. Stephen had lost his composure entirely. The mask of the heartbroken son was gone, replaced by the cornered, arrogant boy he truly was. He stepped into my path, blocking the elevator doors. His chest was heaving. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. He thought he could still intimidate me with volume and corporate titles. You think you won, old man? Stephen sneered, his voice echoing sharply down the long, empty corridor. You think impressing some local judge changes anything? You just delayed the inevitable. You are still barred from the headquarters. I still control the executive board. The company is mine, and I will bleed it completely dry before I ever let you back in the building. I looked at the finger pointing at my face. I looked at the desperate, sweating man who used to be my son. I did not yell back. I did not threaten him. I simply looked at Sullivan, who gave a slow, knowing nod. We had the physical ledgers locked securely in the trunk of Sullivan's car. Stephen thought he controlled the board, but he did not realize the board was about to be seized by federal agents. I stepped around my son, pressed the button for the elevator, and let the metal doors close on his furious red face. The elevator doors sealed shut, cutting off the furious shouting of my son. Sullivan and I descended to the underground parking garage in perfect silence. We had won the morning battle, but the true dismantling of Stephen and his fabricated reality was just beginning. He still believed he had a fortress to retreat to. He still believed his luxury lifestyle was completely insulated from his corporate crimes. He thought a legal defeat in family court was a minor setback. I told Sullivan I had one more delivery to make today. I did not need a ruthless corporate lawyer for this part. I just needed a pristine white folder I had kept locked in my home safe for half a decade. I drove my old pickup truck away from the courthouse and headed toward the exclusive gated community where Stephen and Amanda lived. The contrast between my rusted vehicle and the sprawling neighborhood was sharp. The estate Stephen called his own sat at the end of a private cul-de-sac. It featured iron gates, a manicured sprawling lawn, and a massive stone facade built entirely on the illusion of self-made wealth. Amanda spent her days hosting lavish parties on that lawn, pretending to her socialite friends that her husband was a business genius. I parked my old truck right in the center of their pristine circular driveway. I turned off the engine and leaned against the hood, waiting in the afternoon sun. I did not have to wait long. Stephen sped through the iron gates in his luxury sport utility vehicle. He slammed on the brakes mere inches from my truck, sending gravel flying across the immaculate pavement. He and Amanda stormed out of the vehicle. They were still riding the toxic adrenaline of their courthouse defeat, looking desperately for a target to vent their rage. "What are you doing on my property?" Old man Stephen spat, his face flushed a deep, angry red. "You won a technicality in front of a local judge today. That does not give you the right to trespass. Get your piece of junk truck off my driveway before I call the police and have you arrested." Amanda marched up beside him, crossing her arms tightly. "You are humiliating us, George," she added, her voice shrill and trembling with entitlement. "The neighbors can see you parked out here. Leave us alone. You have done enough damage for one day." I did not raise my voice. I did not acknowledge their insults. I simply reached inside my jacket and pulled out the crisp white folder. I held it out toward my son. Stephen glared at it suspiciously before snatching it from my hand. He ripped open the cover. Amanda leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the bold black text printed across the top of the heavy legal paper. "Immediate 24-hour notice to vacate." Stephen let out a loud, echoing laugh. It was the laugh of a man who was so thoroughly convinced of his own untouchable status that he could not recognize a fatal blow when it was handed directly to him. He tossed the folder back onto the hood of my truck with absolute disdain. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Stephen laughed, shaking his head. "You cannot evict me from my own house. My name is on the deed. I signed the closing paperwork 5 years ago. You have absolutely no legal authority here. Go home, Dad. You are embarrassing yourself, and you are trespassing." I looked at the massive stone pillars of the house. I looked at the perfectly trimmed hedges and the imported sports car idling in the driveway. Then I looked my son directly in the eyes. "You signed a piece of paper 5 years ago, Stephen," I said, my voice perfectly level and cold. "But you did not sign a deed. You signed a lease agreement." Stephen stopped laughing. The smug, arrogant expression on Amanda abruptly faltered. "When you and your wife decided you needed a $5 million house to impress people you did not actually like, I continued, you did not have the credit or the liquid capital to secure a traditional mortgage. Your income did not justify the loan. So my primary corporate holding company bought this property in full with cash. We drew up a standardized residential lease agreement to make you feel like a homeowner while you paid the company back. Stephen stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. The absolute reality of my words was colliding with the fabricated life he had spent years showing off to the world. I set the terms of that lease very generously, I said, tapping the white folder resting on the hood of my truck. But you have not made a single rent payment to the holding company in 5 years. You assumed because I stepped back into retirement, I would just let you live here for free indefinitely. You assumed the property was legally yours because you lived inside it. That is a lie. Amanda shrieked, her voice cracking with sudden raw panic. She grabbed Stephen's arm, shaking him. Tell him it is a lie, Stephen. Tell him our names are on the deed. Stephen could not speak. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very small. He was a man who understood corporate paperwork, and deep down he knew I was meticulous with contracts. He remembered the stack of documents I placed in front of him 5 years ago. He remembered signing them without reading the fine print, because he was too eager to get the keys to the mansion. The holding company owns this land, I stated clearly, ensuring every word landed with devastating precision. And as the fully reinstated primary director of that holding company, I am terminating your month-to-month tenancy for severe non-payment. You have 24 hours to pack whatever fits inside your vehicles and vacate my property. You cannot do this to us, Amanda sobbed, stepping forward pleadingly. Where are we supposed to go? All my things are inside. I looked at the woman who just hours ago sat in a courtroom and lied under oath, trying to lock me inside a psychiatric ward to steal my life savings. You should have thought about your living arrangements before you tried to steal my life, I replied without a single ounce of pity. Stephen finally found his voice. It was no longer a roar of arrogant entitlement. It was a weak, desperate whisper. Dad, please. We have nowhere to go. I have debts. You froze the accounts. We have absolutely zero cash. I opened the door to my rusted truck and climbed inside. I rolled down the window and looked at the 2 people standing on the manicured lawn of a house they never truly owned. 24 hours, Stephen, I said, starting the engine. If you are still standing on this driveway tomorrow morning, the county sheriff will be here to physically remove you for trespassing. I put the truck in drive and slowly pulled out of the circular driveway, leaving my son and his wife standing frozen in the afternoon sun, surrounded by an empire of lies that had just completely collapsed around them. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, the crisp suburban silence of the gated community was shattered by the grinding diesel engines of 3 massive moving trucks. I did not park in the circular driveway this time. I parked my rusted pickup truck halfway down the block, pulling over under the shade of a large oak tree. I rolled my window down and rested my arm against the doorframe. I was not there to gloat or to scream. I was there to oversee the execution of a legal consequence. The heavy white trucks lined up along the pristine curb in front of the massive stone mansion. Right behind them, a county sheriff cruiser pulled up its lights, flashing silently in the morning sun. A tall, broad-shouldered deputy stepped out of the vehicle, holding a thick clipboard. He walked up the manicured walkway and pounded heavily on the custom mahogany front doors. It took nearly 2 minutes before the door swung open. Stephen stood in the threshold. He looked absolutely terrible. His usually perfectly styled hair was a mess, and he wore wrinkled sweatpants and a t-shirt. It was obvious he had spent the entire night frantically calling lawyers, bankers, and anyone else who might lend him cash, only to discover just how radioactive he had become. The biometric lockdown I initiated had effectively erased him from the financial world. The deputy did not offer a polite greeting. He handed Stephen a bright yellow sheet of paper. It was the official writ of possession signed by a magistrate judge at dawn. The 24-hour grace period I had given them was officially over. I watched from the distance as Stephen tried to argue. He waved his arms, pointing back inside the house, desperately trying to explain his fabricated story about ownership and deeds. The deputy simply shook his head, placed a hand on his utility belt, and signaled to the foreman of the moving crew. A team of 10 burly men in matching uniforms marched right past my son and entered the mansion. They did not care about the imported Italian marble floors or the custom silk drapes. They had a job to do. Within seconds, the physical dismantling of Stephen and Amanda's fake life began. Amanda came sprinting out of the front door a moment later. She was wearing a silk bathrobe, her feet bare on the cold stone porch. She was shrieking at the top of her lungs, her voice carrying clearly down the quiet street. She grabbed the arm of a mover who was carrying out a massive, expensive, abstract painting. The deputy immediately stepped between them. He pointed a stern finger at Amanda, warning her that any physical interference with a court-ordered eviction would result in her immediate arrest for obstruction of justice. Amanda recoiled as if she had been physically struck. She turned to Stephen, grabbing him by the shoulders and shaking him violently. She demanded he fix the situation. She ordered him to write a check to call his slick corporate lawyer to make the trucks go away. But Stephen just stood there, completely paralyzed. He had spent his entire adult life throwing my money at his problems. Now the bank accounts were blind trusts that he could not touch. The corporate black cards were canceled. He had absolutely nothing to give her. The movers worked with brutal efficiency. They carried out plush velvet sofas, oversized flat-screen televisions, and racks of designer clothing, dumping them unceremoniously into heavy cardboard boxes on the front lawn. The sheer volume of material wealth they had accumulated using my company funds was staggering to witness. It was an empire of pure vanity, and it was being dragged out onto the grass for the whole world to see. And the world was certainly watching. The commotion had drawn the attention of the neighborhood. These were the ultra-wealthy elite socialites. Amanda had spent the last 5 years desperately trying to impress. They were the people she hosted at lavish catered brunches, pretending her husband was a self-made business genius. Now those same neighbors were stepping out onto their manicured lawns, clutching their morning coffee cups. They were not walking over to help. They were pulling out their smartphones. I watched the glowing screens of a dozen cameras point directly at the eviction. In the age of social media, absolute ruin is a spectator sport. Amanda realized they were being recorded. She looked around at the faces of the women she called her friends, seeing nothing but morbid curiosity and disguised judgment. The social standing she valued more than human decency was evaporating in real time. The panic in Amanda's eyes shifted rapidly into something much more vicious. Survival instinct took over. She realized the luxury life was not a temporary misunderstanding. It was a total, permanent collapse. She realized Stephen was entirely powerless. She backed away from him on the front lawn, her bare feet stepping on the expensive designer clothes spilling out of a nearby moving box. She pointed a shaking finger directly at his chest. Her voice echoed down the street, amplified by her absolute hysteria. "I told you this would happen," Amanda screamed, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered rage. "I told you not to take the money from the commercial accounts. You said your father was too stupid to notice. You said you could hide the transfers in the warehouse budget." Stephen lunged forward, trying to cover her mouth with his hand, looking desperately at the recording neighbors. "Shut up, Amanda," he hissed frantically. "You are going to send us both to prison. Keep your mouth shut." But Amanda pushed him away, completely unraveling under the pressure of the public humiliation. She wanted the neighbors to know she was a victim, not an accomplice. She wanted to save herself by throwing her husband directly under the bus. "It was all your idea," she shrieked, making sure every smartphone microphone on the street captured her words. "You are the one who forged his signature on those bank documents. You are the one who owes money to those dangerous people downtown. I am not going down for your illegal gambling debts, Stephen. I will tell the police everything." I sat in the cab of my truck and listened to the echoes of her betrayal. The alliance between my son and his wife had been built entirely on stolen money and shared arrogance. The moment the money disappeared, The alliance fractured into a million jagged pieces. They were tearing each other apart on a manicured lawn, broadcasting their federal crimes to anyone willing to listen. The deputy took a step forward, pulling a notepad from his pocket, clearly taking notes on the spontaneous confession of corporate fraud and forgery happening right in front of him. The movers continued to carry out boxes, ignoring the shouting match. I had seen enough. The illusion was completely shattered. They were homeless, publicly disgraced, and actively building a criminal case against themselves on neighborhood cameras. But I knew the danger was far from over. Stephen was cornered, humiliated, and desperate. And desperate men who owe money to violent underground syndicates do not just give up. They become highly destructive. I rolled up the window of my truck, blocking out the sound of Amanda screaming. I put the vehicle in and slowly pulled away from the curb. I left them standing in the wreckage of their own greed. I had to prepare for the next phase because cutting off their money was only the beginning. The people Stephen owed money to were going to realize they were not getting paid, and I had to make sure my employees and my warehouses were heavily guarded when the inevitable panic set in. I drove toward the highway, watching the massive estate shrink in my rearview mirror until it disappeared completely. I sat in the back booth of the Silver Star Diner, watching the rain hit the dirty glass window. It had been 12 hours since the moving trucks cleared out the estate. The initial shock of the eviction had passed, and the true panic was setting in. I ordered a simple black coffee and waited. I knew Stephen would find me here. I had brought him to this exact diner every Saturday morning when he was a boy. Back then, I would spread out the regional shipping maps on this very table and teach him how the logistics routes worked. He used to listen with wide eyes, eager to learn the family business. The man who burst through the diner doors this afternoon had absolutely nothing in common with that boy. The bell above the entrance rang so violently that a few customers turned their heads. Stephen stood in the doorway, breathing heavily. He was soaking wet from the rain, wearing the same wrinkled clothes from the eviction. His eyes darted around this room with raw, unfiltered paranoia. He spotted me in the corner booth and practically ran across the tiled floor, sliding into the vinyl seat across from me. His hands were shaking so badly he had to press them flat against the table to make them stop. "Dad, you have to help me," Stephen whispered, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. "You have to unfreeze the holding accounts right now. I need $500,000 in cash by midnight, or I am completely dead." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I did not react to his panic. I looked at the dark circles forming under his eyes and the sheer terror vibrating through his body. "Why do you need $500,000 by midnight?" "Stephen," I asked, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "Tell me exactly where my corporate funds have been going for the last 2 years." He swallowed hard, looking nervously over his shoulder at the empty diner booths. He thought he could still play games, but the reality of his situation finally broke him. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "I owe money, Dad. A lot of money. The people I was doing business with are not bankers. They run the underground sports books in the city. I fell behind on my payments. They offered to let me wash their cash through our freight manifests to clear the debt. I thought I could control it. I thought I could use the corporate accounts to make it all balance out. But when you initiated the biometric lockdown this morning, all the automated washing payments bounced. 3 of their massive wire transfers were rejected, and the money disappeared into the federal holding ether." He reached across this table and grabbed my arm. His grip was entirely desperate. "They called me an hour ago, Dad. They do not care about the lockdown or the court orders. They think I stole their street money. They told me if I do not deliver $500,000 in clean cash by midnight, they are going to find Amanda. And then they are going to find me. You have to wire the funds. It is the only way to save my life." I looked down at the hand grabbing my arm. I remembered teaching that hand how to hold a baseball bat. I remembered teaching that hand how to steer a delivery truck. Now that hand was covered in the filth of organized crime. I pulled my arm away and rested my hands around my warm coffee mug. You are asking me to take the money I earned through 40 years of honest labor and hand it over to a violent criminal syndicate, I stated, making sure every single word landed with devastating clarity. You are asking me to use the college funds of my employees' children to pay off your illegal gambling debts. Stevens stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. I am your son, he pleaded, his voice rising in volume. Are you seriously going to let them kill me over corporate profits? I did not raise my voice. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us. You made your choice the day you forged my signature on a medical document to lock me inside a psychiatric ward, I replied ruthlessly. You were perfectly willing to destroy my mind and steal my freedom so you could continue playing pretend with the criminal underworld. You wanted to be a ruthless corporate executive, Stephen. You wanted to swim with the sharks. Now you are bleeding in the water, and you expect me to throw you a life raft made out of my own flesh. Dad, please, Stephen sobbed, actual tears spilling down his cheeks. I will sign whatever you want. I will walk away from the company completely. Just pay them off. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single $5 bill. I placed it on the table to cover the cost of my coffee. I will not pay a single dime to criminals, I said, standing up from the booth. I will not let you use my legacy to fund the syndicate. If you are in physical danger, I suggest you walk out of this diner, go straight to the federal building downtown, and turn yourself in to the authorities. A prison cell is the only place those people cannot reach you right now. I turned my back on my son and walked toward the exit. He did not follow me. He stayed frozen in the booth, completely shattered, realizing that his final safety net had been completely severed. He was entirely on his own. I drove back to my modest suburban home as the evening sky turned dark gray. The rain had stopped, but a heavy, thick fog was rolling through the neighborhood. I parked my rusted truck in the driveway and walked inside. The house was completely silent. I locked the heavy oak door and turned on the porch light. I knew the syndicate would not just accept a bounced payment and disappear. They were violent predators, and predators always follow the money trail. If Stephen could not pay them, they would inevitably come looking for the man who controlled the accounts. I walked into my dark kitchen and poured a glass of cold water. I did not turn on the interior lights. I stood by the front window, pushing the curtain aside just an inch to look out onto the quiet street. 10 minutes passed in absolute silence. Then a massive dark sport utility vehicle slowly rolled down my street. It did not have its headlights on. The vehicle glided through the fog like a shark hunting in deep water. It rolled past the surrounding houses and came to a slow, deliberate stop right in front of my driveway. The engine rumbled with a low, menacing growl. The tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside, but I did not need to see their faces. I knew exactly why they were here. The financial war had officially crossed over into a physical threat. I let the curtain fall back into place and walked toward my home office safe. It was time to prepare for a very different kind of fight. I stood in the dark kitchen watching the street through a narrow gap in the curtains. The menacing sport utility vehicle idled by the curb for 20 agonizing minutes before its heavy tires finally rolled away into the thick fog. I did not let my guard down. I kept my hand resting on the solid oak counter, waiting for their next move. 10 minutes later, a much smaller car pulled into my driveway. The headlights cut through the mist. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from the kitchen drawer and walked silently to the front door. I looked through the peephole expecting to see an enforcer sent by the underground syndicate to collect my son's debts. Instead, I saw a face I had not seen in 4 long years. It was my daughter, Rachel. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy oak door open. Rachel stood under the yellow glow of the porch light, holding a small overnight bag. She wore a simple denim jacket, and her dark hair was pulled back tightly. She looked exactly like her late mother, Barbara. The resemblance sent a sudden sharp ache through my chest. We did not embrace. We did not cry. The chasm between us had been dug too deep over the years to be filled instantly with a simple greeting. She stepped inside out of the cold, damp night, and I locked the door behind her. "I saw the video online, Dad," she said, dropping her bag onto the floor. Her voice was firm and carried the same authoritative weight I used in the boardroom. The whole internet saw Amanda throwing a hysterical tantrum on the front lawn of the estate. I watched the moving trucks carry out their ridiculous luxury furniture. "You finally did it. You finally cut him off." I walked into the kitchen and turned on a single small lamp above the stove. I asked her if she wanted a cup of coffee. She nodded, pulling out a wooden chair and sitting at the table where she used to do her homework as a little girl. I poured the dark liquid into 2 ceramic mugs and set one in front of her. I sat across the table, resting my calloused hands on the polished wood. "I left 4 years ago because I could not watch you hand over the keys of the kingdom to a spoiled, arrogant boy," Rachel said, wrapping her fingers around the warm mug. Her eyes were piercing and completely unforgiving. "You let Stephen treat the warehouse staff like garbage. He strutted around the executive suite, treating the business you and Mom built like his own personal piggy bank. You turned a blind eye to his entitlement because he was the golden boy. You thought you could fix him by giving him responsibility. It broke my heart to watch him destroy everything we stood for." I looked down at the dark surface of my coffee. I did not try to self. I did not offer weak excuses about family harmony or my grief over losing Barbara. "You were absolutely right, Rachel." I admitted the bitter taste of failure coating my mouth. I thought giving him power would force him to mature. I thought the weight of leadership would straighten his spine. Instead, I just funded his corruption. I enabled a monster because I was too tired to fight him. I am deeply sorry I did not listen to you when you tried to warn me." Rachel watched my face closely. She was looking for any sign of weakness or manipulation, but she found only the cold, hard truth. She took a slow sip of her coffee and placed her hands flat on the table. The tension in her shoulders shifted into something much more urgent. "I did not drive 3 hours in the middle of the night just to say I told you so, Dad," she stated, her expression hardening into pure business. "I came because the situation is much worse than a public eviction. I still talk to a few people in Amanda's social circle. When the sheriff threw them out this morning, Amanda had a complete mental breakdown. She started frantically calling her wealthy friends, begging for a place to sleep tonight." Rachel leaned forward, lowering her voice to an urgent whisper. None of her friends offered her a spare bedroom. But Amanda was screaming so loudly over the phone that she let a crucial piece of information slip. She told her former best friend that Stephen had a guaranteed plan to get $500,000 in clean cash by tomorrow morning. My blood ran cold. The syndicate had demanded exactly $500,000 by midnight. Stephen had begged me for that exact amount in the diner just hours ago. He knows the bank accounts are frozen. Rachel continued, her eyes locked onto mine. He knows the holding company is locked down under your biometric seal. But he also knows the corporate insurance policies on the commercial properties are still fully active. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. The insurance policies covered catastrophic structural losses. "He is going to burn down the main logistics warehouse tonight," Rachel said, vocalizing the absolute nightmare forming in my mind. "He thinks a massive commercial insurance payout will generate enough clean cash to cover his syndicate debts. He is planning to torch the entire primary facility and claim it was a tragic electrical fire." I stood up abruptly from the kitchen table, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. The main logistics warehouse was not just a building made of steel and concrete. It was the beating heart of the entire regional empire. But more importantly, it was a 24-hour operation. There are 300 men and women working the night shift in that facility right now. I said, the crushing gravity of the threat settling over the room. 300 families rely on those paychecks to put food on their tables. There are forklift operators, dispatchers, and loading dock workers walking those floors who have been loyal to this company for decades. Stephen was no longer just trying to steal my retirement funds. He was no longer just running a money laundering scheme for organized crime. He was completely trapped and operating on pure primal panic. He was willing to burn down a massive commercial structure and risk the lives and livelihoods of hundreds of innocent people just to save his own skin from the mob. I realized in that exact moment that the war had fundamentally shifted. I could not just protect my bank accounts and my legacy from the safety of my locked suburban home. Freezing the finances had backed a desperate predator into a corner. Now I had to prevent that predator from destroying the people who depended on me. I grabbed my truck keys from the kitchen counter and looked at my daughter, knowing exactly what had to be done. The midnight air inside the primary logistics facility was thick and smelled heavily of diesel fuel damp, cardboard, and decades of hard labor. I stood in the deep shadows of the rear loading dock, perfectly still. Beside me stood Jim. Jim had been my lead warehouse foreman for 30 years. We had unloaded our very first freight trucks together when my hair was still dark and my joints did not ache in the winter cold. We built this facility with our bare hands. Now we were waiting in the pitch-black darkness to protect the very foundation of the company from my own flesh and blood. The facility was usually humming with third-shift activity moving cargo across 3 state lines. But tonight, I had quietly ordered the entire floor cleared. I sent the night crew on a fully paid extended break to the secondary staging lot, a mile down the highway. The massive warehouse was completely empty, reduced to a vast cavern of towering steel shelving and parked delivery rigs. I could not risk a single one of my employees getting caught in the crossfire. I could not let innocent people suffer because of the syndicate debt my son had dragged to our doorstep. The sudden sound of shattering glass echoed like a gunshot through the cavernous space. It came from the rear access door near the administrative offices. Jim stiffened beside me, resting his hand firmly on a heavy steel flashlight. We watched in absolute silence as the metal door was violently kicked open. A narrow flashlight beam cut wildly through the dark, sweeping across the concrete floor. Stephen stepped inside. He was not wearing his expensive, tailored suits or his polished designer shoes. He wore dark, nondescript clothing, a baseball cap pulled low over his face, and a heavy canvas jacket. He moved with a frantic, uncoordinated energy, stumbling clumsily over a discarded wooden pallet. In his hands he carried 2 large red plastic gasoline cans. The metallic clanking of the heavy containers echoed ominously off the high corrugated ceiling. I was completely out of his mind with primal panic. He had convinced himself that the only way to generate a massive influx of clean cash was to turn the company headquarters into an insurance claim ash heap. He walked toward the center of the main staging floor, dropping one can and unscrewing the cap of the other. The sharp, toxic scent of unleaded fuel immediately began to fill the enclosed space, burning the back of my throat. He was pouring the accelerant directly over the primary shipping manifests and the base of the main structural support columns. He was actively destroying the heart of the empire to cover his own pathetic gambling debts. I nodded silently to Jim. Jim reached over and slammed his hand against the master breaker switch mounted on the concrete wall. A dozen high-intensity industrial floodlights snapped on instantly, bathing the entire warehouse floor in blinding, sterile white light. Stephen froze dead in his tracks. The heavy gasoline can slipped from his trembling hands, hitting the concrete floor with a loud thud. Amber fluid spilled out, pooling rapidly around his sneakers. He threw his arm up to shield his eyes from the sudden, overwhelming glare. I stepped out from the shadows of the loading dock and walked into the center of the light. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured steps of a man who owned every single inch of concrete beneath his boots. Stephen stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute, unfiltered horror. He looked exactly like a cornered animal. His face was pale, glistening with a cold sweat, and his breathing was ragged and shallow. "What are you doing here?" he stammered, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his own guilt. "You are supposed to be locked in your house. You are supposed to be hiding." I stopped 10 feet away from him, keeping a safe distance from the spreading puddle of gasoline. You are going to burn down the livelihood of 300 honest families to save yourself from a gambling debt, I stated, my voice echoing loudly off the steel walls. You are going to turn a company built on 40 years of sweat and sacrifice into a fraudulent insurance claim. You are not a businessman, Stephen. You are a coward. Stephen backed away, his boots slipping slightly on the wet concrete. You do not understand what those people will do to me, he screamed, his panic shifting rapidly into a desperate, raw fury. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest. They are going to kill me. I need that commercial insurance payout. It is the only way out of this mess. I am your son. You have to let me do this. You have to walk away right now and let this building burn. I looked at the toxic fuel soaking into the foundation of my legacy. I looked at the man who had forged my signature, tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward, and stripped his own life bare of any moral decency. He felt no remorse for the employees he was about to put out of work. He only felt sorry for himself. I will never let you destroy the people who trusted me, I replied smoothly, refusing to give him a single inch of ground. The fire is not happening tonight. There will be no multi-million-dollar insurance claim. You are going to face the brutal consequences of the criminal life you actively chose. The realization hit Stephen like a physical blow to the head. Without a catastrophic fire, he had no money. Without the money, the syndicate would end his life. He looked at the spilled gasoline, and then he looked directly at me. In his twisted, desperate mind, I was the only obstacle left standing between him and his survival. His pure desperation completely overrode whatever tiny shred of humanity he had left inside his soul. He dropped his flashlight. He turned to a nearby heavy maintenance cart and grabbed a solid steel crowbar. You are doing this to me, Stephen roared, his face contorting into a mask of pure, violent rage. You froze the accounts. You kicked me out of my house. You ruined my life. You are killing me. He gripped the heavy steel crowbar with both hands and charged directly at me. He was crossing the distance fast. The metal weapon raised high above his head, fully prepared to strike down his own father to secure a fraudulent payout. Jim stepped forward from the shadows, raising his heavy flashlight to intervene and protect me, but he did not need to. I did not flinch, and I did not step back. I knew exactly what was about to happen. Before Stephen could cross the final 5 feet, the warehouse was suddenly bathed in a chaotic, blinding storm of flashing red and blue lights. The brilliant colors strobed violently through the high upper windows and the open rear access door. The deafening wail of multiple police sirens shattered the quiet night, vibrating through the steel walls of the building. Rachel had done exactly what we meticulously planned. While I acted as the bait to keep Stephen occupied and talking inside the warehouse, my daughter had coordinated directly with Michael Sullivan and the local police department. They had been waiting silently in the dark secondary parking lot the entire time, listening to a live audio feed from a transmitter in my pocket. Stephen froze completely. His arms still raised, the steel crowbar trembling weakly in his grip. The heavy metal roll-up doors at the front of the warehouse suddenly roared open, the chains rattling loudly. A dozen uniformed police officers swarmed onto the warehouse floor, their weapons drawn and their tactical flashlights cutting through the bright industrial glare. They ordered Stephen to drop the weapon and get on the ground immediately. The harsh reality of the flashing lights and the shouted authoritative commands completely broke his spirit. The heavy crowbar clattered loudly onto the concrete floor. He dropped heavily to his knees right in the middle of the gasoline puddle and put his hands on the back of his head. 2 officers rushed forward, forcing him flat onto his stomach and securing heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. I stood perfectly still and watched them pull him up from the floor. He was no longer a wealthy corporate director. He was a desperate felon being arrested for attempted commercial arson and aggravated assault. The empire he tried to steal was safe, and his reign of terror was officially over. The interrogation room at the district attorney office was as cold and sterile as a hospital morgue. I sat next to my lawyer, Michael Sullivan, at a long metal table bolted directly to the floor. The air smelled of stale coffee and impending prison sentences. We were not the ones under investigation. We were the cooperating victims. Stephen was currently sitting in a holding cell 3 floors below us, stripped of his tailored suit and wearing standard-issue county orange. He had been denied bail immediately because of his direct documented ties to a violent regional crime syndicate. He was a flight risk and a danger to the community. The heavy metal door clicked open and Amanda walked in. She did not look like the pristine, arrogant socialite who had tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward just days prior. Her face was pale, and her designer clothes were deeply wrinkled. She was trembling visibly, her eyes darting around the small concrete room like a trapped animal. She was accompanied by a frantic defense attorney she had likely hired using the last few dollars in her personal checking account. Amanda did not even look at me when she sat down across the metal table. She refused to make eye contact with the man whose life she had tried to systematically dismantle. Instead, she looked directly at District Attorney Collins, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had built her career locking up white-collar criminals. Amanda's lawyer immediately started talking fast, trying to secure a lifeline for his client before the federal charges were officially filed. He announced that Amanda was a victim of her husband's manipulation. He stated with a straight face that she had absolutely no idea the extent of his criminal activities or his involvement with the underground syndicate. He said Amanda was willing to turn state's evidence and testify completely against Stephen in court. In exchange, she wanted full and total immunity from all corporate fraud and conspiracy charges. District Attorney Collins folded her hands on the table and let a long, heavy silence fill the room. She looked at Amanda with the kind of predatory patience that only seasoned prosecutors possess. She told Amanda that immunity is not handed out for free just because a wife decides to betray her husband. She explained that they already had the physical ledgers. They already had the security footage from the warehouse, and they already had the forged medical documents. She told Amanda she needed a golden ticket. She needed something the federal financial investigators did not already have. Amanda leaned forward, her voice dripping with pure desperation and cold calculation. She said Stephen had a secret offshore safety net. She explained it was a blind account registered in the Cayman Islands that he used to funnel the clean cash before moving it to the syndicate. She said she was the only other person on Earth who knew it existed. She promised it held millions of dollars in stolen corporate funds. She said she had the exact routing numbers and the digital access tokens memorized. She offered to hand over the entire account to the federal government in exchange for her absolute freedom. She was trying to use the money they stole from me to buy her way out of a prison cell. Sullivan looked at me from the corner of his eye. I kept my face entirely blank. I did not flinch and I did not interrupt. I just watched the absolute moral bankruptcy of my daughter-in-law unfold under the harsh fluorescent lights. District Attorney Collins motioned for the federal financial investigator sitting in the corner of the room to step forward with his encrypted laptop. The investigator placed the heavy computer on the metal table and opened it. Amanda reached into her pocket with shaking hands and pulled out a crumpled piece of hotel stationery. She read off a long, complex string of routing numbers and alphanumeric passwords. The investigator typed the credentials into the federal tracking database. The room fell completely silent. The only sound was the rapid, sharp clicking of the laptop keyboard. Amanda sat back in her metal chair. A smug, satisfied look briefly returned to her face. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. She truly believed she had just bought her way out of a federal indictment. She believed she was about to walk out of that concrete room a free woman, leaving her husband to rot in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his life. The investigator stopped typing. He stared at the screen for a long, agonizing moment. He clicked one more key and then looked directly at the district attorney. He turned the laptop around so everyone at the table could see the glowing monitor. Amanda leaned forward, expecting to see a digital fortune in stolen corporate funds. Instead, she saw a glaring red zero. The account was completely empty. The federal investigator scrolled down to the transaction history. He announced that the offshore account had been fully liquidated and drained completely dry 48 hours ago. Stephen had systematically wiped out their secret safety net in a desperate blind panic, trying to satisfy the syndicate before he decided to resort to burning down my warehouse. Amanda stopped breathing. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost. Her hands flew to her mouth in absolute horror. She realized in that exact moment that Stephen had betrayed her before she even had the chance to betray him. He had taken her secret leverage and thrown it into a black hole of underground gambling debts. He had sacrificed her safety net to buy himself a few more hours of breathing room from the mob. She had absolutely no money left. She had no leverage left to offer the district attorney. She had nothing. District Attorney Collins reached out and calmly closed the file folder on her desk. She looked at Amanda with absolute zero pity. She explained in a very steady voice that since the account was completely empty, Amanda had brought absolutely nothing of value to the table. Therefore, there would be no immunity deal. She informed Amanda that she was now officially considered a primary co-conspirator in the forgery of legal documents and the attempted theft of corporate assets. Amanda let out a gut-wrenching scream of pure, unfiltered panic. She slammed her hands against the metal table, sobbing hysterically and begging the district attorney to reconsider. She screamed that it was not fair and that Stephen had ruined her life. Her cheap lawyer immediately stood up and started packing his briefcase. He did not offer her a single word of comfort. He realized he was never going to get paid for this meeting, and he was abandoning his client right there in the interrogation room. I stood up from the table slowly. I buttoned my jacket and looked down at the woman who had stood on my front porch and demanded I beg for a grocery allowance. I looked at the woman who had laughed at me and called me a senile old man. She was now facing a decade in a federal prison cell, penniless, humiliated, and entirely alone. I did not offer her a single word of sympathy. I did not need to say anything at all. The crushing weight of her own greed had done all the talking for me. I turned my back on her hysterical sobbing and walked out of the interrogation room with Michael Sullivan, leaving the heavy metal door to shut firmly behind us. I visited Barbara every Sunday at exactly noon. Her headstone sat beneath a massive weeping willow on a quiet hill overlooking the city. I always brought her a fresh bouquet of yellow roses. They were her favorite. For 30 years, I used this time to talk to her about the logistics fleet, about the new drivers we hired, and about the quiet peace of growing old. I never brought the ugliness of the corporate world to her resting place. Today, however, the ugliness followed me. I knew the dark sport utility vehicle had been trailing my rusted pickup truck since I left the district attorney office. I did not try to lose them in traffic. I drove exactly the speed limit and led them directly to the cemetery gates. I wanted this confrontation to happen in broad daylight, out in the open, on ground where I felt completely grounded. I knelt in the soft green grass and placed the yellow roses against the cold gray granite. The afternoon sun was bright and warm, but the approaching footsteps behind me were heavy and deliberate. I did not turn around immediately. I finished brushing a fallen leaf off Barbara's name before I slowly stood up and faced my visitor. The man standing 5 feet away did not look like a street-level criminal. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, polished leather shoes, and a heavy silver watch. He looked like a regional banking executive. He took his sunglasses off and folded them neatly into his breast pocket. He looked respectfully at the headstone for a brief moment before shifting his cold, dead eyes directly to me. He did not introduce himself. He did not need to. We both knew exactly why he was standing in a graveyard on a Tuesday afternoon. "Your son made a very foolish mistake," the man said. His voice was smooth, highly educated, and entirely devoid of emotion. He borrowed a substantial amount of operating capital from my employers. He guaranteed repayment using your corporate shipping manifests as collateral. We understand he is currently sitting in a holding cell, facing significant federal fraud charges. That is very unfortunate for him. However, a jail sentence does not erase a financial obligation. My employers expect the $500,000 by Friday evening. The man took a slow step forward, closing the distance between us. He lowered his voice, turning a polite conversation into a lethal threat. We know you froze the corporate accounts, George. We know you initiated a biometric lockdown. My employers respect a man who protects his assets. But you have 300 employees working the night shifts at your facilities. You have millions of dollars in rolling freight crossing the state lines every single night. It would be a terrible tragedy if those trucks started experiencing catastrophic brake failures on the highway. It would be a nightmare if your warehouse workers started suffering severe accidents on the loading docks. Pay your son's debt, George. Consider it a necessary business tax to keep your people safe. I was trying to use the lives of my workers as leverage. He thought the threat of physical violence would break an old man. He thought I would panic and wire the funds just to make the nightmare go away. I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact. I reached inside the interior pocket of my worn canvas jacket. The man in the tailored suit tensed slightly, his hand twitching toward his waistline. He thought I was reaching for a weapon. He was wrong. I was reaching for something much more dangerous than a firearm. I pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope and held it out toward him. Take it, I commanded. My voice carried the absolute, unshakable authority of a man who had stared down corporate sharks for 4 decades. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking the envelope. He tore open the top flap and pulled out the stack of crisp white papers inside. I watched his eyes scan the top page. It was a photocopy of the physical ledger my loyal payroll manager had smuggled out of the executive suite in a recycling bin. It showed his syndicate's exact routing numbers. It showed the specific dates and the precise dollar amounts of the dirty cash they had funneled into my company. Flip to the second page, I instructed calmly. He flipped the paper. The second page was a printed screenshot of the offshore wire transfers Stephen had attempted to initiate. But it was the third page that made the color drain completely from the enforcer's face. The third page was a formal receipt of evidence from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was stamped, dated, and signed by the lead financial crimes investigator I had met inside the district attorney office just hours ago. You think you can intimidate me by threatening the men and women who work on my warehouse floors, I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. You think you are the only one who knows how to apply leverage. The man in the suit swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the federal seal on the paper. My lawyers have already handed the encrypted digital drives over to the federal prosecutor, I explained, making sure he understood the absolute finality of my words. The government is already tracking the shell companies your employers use to wash their cash. But they do not have the physical ledgers yet. They do not have the undeniable handwritten proof of the syndicate's regional leadership. I have locked those original ledgers inside a secure third-party vault. I leaned in closer. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the scent of the freshly cut cemetery grass. I have established a legal dead man switch with my attorneys, I stated clearly. If a single one of my delivery trucks gets a flat tire, if a single warehouse worker trips and falls on the loading dock, or if I suffer a sudden tragic medical emergency, that vault will automatically open. The unredacted physical books containing every single name, routing number, and payout schedule belonging to your bosses will be delivered directly to the federal task force by courier. The enforcer stopped breathing. The polished, threatening demeanor completely evaporated. I was a professional criminal, and he understood the brutal math of the situation perfectly. Stephen's $500,000 debt was absolute pennies compared to the total destruction of their entire regional money laundering operation. You will not see a single dime from my accounts, I said, delivering the final blow. Stephen is a dead end. He is a liability who brought the federal government right to your front door. If you or your employers ever approach me, my family, or my business again, I will trigger the switch myself and bury you all under a federal racketeering indictment. The man slowly slid the papers back into the manila envelope. He looked at me not with anger, but with a sudden, sharp realization that he had walked into a fatal trap. He was looking at a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to protect. He did not offer another threat. He did not say another word. He simply turned around and walked swiftly down the paved cemetery path, his polished shoes clicking rapidly against the stone. He climbed into the dark sport utility vehicle, started the engine, and drove away, disappearing down the rolling hills. The syndicate threat was permanently neutralized. They would cut their losses and vanish into the shadows to protect their empire from the federal sweep. I stood alone in the quiet cemetery, listening to the wind rustle through the weeping willow tree. I looked down at the yellow roses resting against Barbara's headstone. I had protected the employees. I had protected the legacy, but the company itself was still infected. Stephen had spent the last 2 years filling the executive boardroom with arrogant sycophants and greedy vice presidents who had gladly turned a blind eye to his corruption as long as their own bonuses cleared. They had watched him lock me out and done absolutely nothing. I walked back to my rusted pickup truck and climbed inside the cab. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed my corporate secretary. It was time to rip the remaining rot out of the foundation. I told her to send a mandatory urgent summons to every single member of the executive board. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, the founder was coming back to the boardroom to clean house. I walked into the primary executive boardroom on the 50th floor of the corporate tower at exactly 8:50 in the morning. The room was a monument to the immense vanity of my son. He had removed the sturdy oak conference table I bought 30 years ago and replaced it with a massive slab of imported Italian marble. The plush leather chairs surrounding the table cost more than what my best forklift operators made in an entire month of hard labor. Sitting in those expensive chairs were the 6 vice presidents Stephen had hired during his brief and disastrous reign as acting director. They were men and women in perfectly tailored suits who had never backed a commercial transport truck into a loading dock or swept a dusty warehouse floor. They were corporate sycophants who had gladly watched my son bleed the company dry as long as their quarterly bonus checks cleared the bank. I took my place at the head of the heavy marble table. Michael Sullivan stood silently in the corner of the room, holding a thick leather briefcase. I did not sit down. I placed my hands flat against the cold stone surface and looked at each of the executives one by one. The silence in the room was absolute and entirely suffocating. They already knew about the police raid at the main warehouse. They knew their golden boy was currently processing out of a county jail cell. But they falsely believed their own comfortable jobs were safe. They thought they could simply pivot their loyalty back to the founder and continue collecting their massive executive paychecks. I looked directly at the vice president of finance. I asked him how a man with a master's degree from a highly prestigious university failed to notice $2 million of corporate capital being diverted into an offshore shell company. He opened his mouth to stammer a pathetic excuse about compartmentalized budgets and digital routing errors. I did not let him finish his sentence. I told him he was either dangerously incompetent or an active participant in federal fraud, and that either way, his career in my building was completely finished. I turned my attention to the vice president of operations. I asked him why he authorized deep budget cuts to the warehouse safety protocols while simultaneously approving a $50,000 catering budget for the private executive dining room. He looked down at his polished leather shoes and remained completely silent. I looked at the vice president of human resources and asked her why she allowed a loyal payroll manager like Beverly to be demoted and stripped of her pension simply because my son thought she was too old to fit the corporate image. She tried to offer a weak apology. I told her apologies do not pay for groceries. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to yell to dismantle their fragile authority. I told all 6 of them that their employment was terminated effective immediately. I informed them that corporate security was waiting outside the glass doors with empty cardboard boxes and that they had exactly 10 minutes to clear out their desks before they were escorted off the property for criminal trespassing. One of the executives tried to protest, claiming he had an ironclad employment contract with a lucrative severance clause. Sullivan stepped forward from the corner and placed a single sheet of paper on the marble table. He informed the executive that the federal authorities were currently auditing every single signature on those contracts, and that any man who tried to extort a severance package would find himself named as an unindicted co-conspirator in a racketeering investigation. The executives stood up without another word and hurried out of the boardroom, their heads bowed in absolute and total defeat. As soon as the heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, I pressed the intercom button on the center console. I told my secretary to send the new board members inside. The doors opened again, and 3 people walked into the room. It was Jim, my lead warehouse foreman, still wearing his scuffed steel-toed boots and his bright yellow high-visibility vest. Beside him was Beverly, my loyal payroll manager, who had risked her freedom to smuggle the physical ledgers out of the building. The third person was a senior logistics dispatcher named Leo, who had been coordinating our complex freight routes flawlessly for 2 decades. They looked slightly uncomfortable standing in the lavish executive suite, but they carried the genuine weight of honest, hard labor. I pointed to the empty leather chairs and told them to sit down. I explained that a company is only as strong as the people who actually build it. I told them they were the new operational directors of the entire regional network. I needed people in the boardroom who understood the value of $1 and the importance of a hard day's work. Jim looked at the imported marble table and shook his head, telling me we needed to sell the ridiculous furniture and put the money back into the employee health insurance fund. I smiled for the first time in days and told him that was exactly why he was now the senior vice president of operations. We were just beginning to review the recovery protocols for the shipping manifests when a sudden violent commotion erupted in the reception area outside the glass doors. I heard my secretary shouting a stern warning, followed by the heavy sound of a physical struggle. The thick boardroom doors were suddenly shoved open with immense force. Stephen walked into the room. He looked absolutely terrible. He was no longer wearing a tailored designer suit or a county jail uniform. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt and dark slacks. His face was pale and deeply exhausted, but his eyes burned with a frantic, manic arrogance. He had somehow scraped together enough money through a shady bail bondsman to secure his temporary release before the federal charges were officially handed down. I was not alone. Walking right behind him was a tall, slick-looking defense lawyer, wearing a highly expensive gray suit and carrying a slim leather portfolio. The lawyer had the smug, greasy smile of a man who specialized in exploiting complex corporate loopholes. Stephen looked at Jim and Beverly sitting in the executive chairs and let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He demanded to know why the warehouse trash was sitting at his private conference table. Jim stood up, his fists clenched at his sides, fully ready to throw my son out the 50th floor window, but I raised my hand to stop him. I told Jim and the others to stay seated. I looked at Stephen and asked him what part of his felony arson arrest made him think he was still welcome inside my corporate headquarters. Stephen walked right up to the edge of the marble table, leaning his hands heavily against the cold stone. He sneered at me, telling me that he might have lost the battle at the warehouse, but he was certainly not walking away empty-handed. His smug lawyer stepped forward and opened the slim leather portfolio. The lawyer spoke with a smooth, highly practiced cadence. He addressed me and Sullivan, stating that while his client was facing some unfortunate personal legal misunderstandings, those minor issues did not invalidate his formal corporate equity. The lawyer slid a crisp legal document across the vast marble table. He reminded us that when I named Stephen as the acting director 5 years ago, I legally transferred 40% of the total corporate shares into his name to solidify his standing. Stephen smiled a cold, absolutely desperate smile. He knew the criminal syndicate was no longer my problem, but he also knew he still needed massive amounts of cash to flee to a non-extradition country and pay for a defense team that could keep him out of a federal penitentiary. He pointed a trembling finger at me and demanded that I buy out his entire 40% equity stake right this second. He demanded a certified cashier check for $40 million by the end of the business day. He threatened that if I did not pay him immediately, he would sell his massive share of the company to our biggest corporate rival and completely destroy the logistics network from the inside out. He thought he had found the ultimate legal loophole. He truly believed he still had a knife pressed firmly to my throat. I looked at the legal demand resting on the table, and then I looked over at Michael Sullivan. Sullivan did not look worried or intimidated in the slightest. He looked incredibly bored. I turned my attention back to my desperate, arrogant son. I kept my voice perfectly calm and steady as I prepared to drop the final financial guillotine on his entire pathetic existence. I looked at the piece of crisp legal paper resting on the cold Italian marble table. It was a formal demand letter insisting on a $40 million buyout for my son's 40% equity stake in the logistics company. Stephen stood at the edge of the table, breathing heavily, with a smug, frantic look in his eyes. He truly believed he had me trapped. Beside him, his expensive defense lawyer stood with his chin raised, exuding the unearned arrogance of a man who thought he was dealing with a simple, uneducated truck driver. The lawyer began to speak with a smooth, highly practiced cadence. He lectured me on minority shareholder rights. He talked about fiduciary duties and the legal requirements of corporate equity liquidation. He spoke for 3 uninterrupted minutes, trying to build a wall of legal jargon that would force me to panic and write a massive check just to make them go away. I did not interrupt him. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. I sat in silence and let the man completely exhaust his vocabulary. When the slick lawyer finally finished his speech, he crossed his arms and waited for my surrender. Jim and Beverly sat perfectly still in their executive chairs, watching the confrontation with unwavering loyalty. I looked at the lawyer and asked him a very simple question. I asked him if he had bothered to do his basic due diligence and actually read the founding corporate charter before he decided to storm into my headquarters and make a $40 million demand. The lawyer scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. He claimed that standard modern corporate law vastly superseded any outdated founder agreements drawn up 30 years ago. He stated that his client's 40% equity was a matter of public record and could not simply be erased because of a family disagreement. Michael Sullivan stepped forward from the dark corner of the boardroom. He did not look like a man preparing to negotiate. He looked like a corporate executioner. Sullivan placed his heavy briefcase on the marble table and clicked the brass locks open. He reached inside and pulled out a thick document bound in heavy dark leather. The pages were slightly yellowed with age. It was the original founding charter of the logistics empire that my late wife Barbara and I had meticulously drafted at our kitchen table decades ago. Sullivan slid the heavy document across the smooth marble surface until it came to a rest directly in front of the smug defense lawyer. Sullivan did not raise his voice, but his tone was razor-sharp. He instructed the lawyer to open the document and turn specifically to Section 4, Paragraph 9. The lawyer looked slightly annoyed, but he opened the heavy leather cover and flipped through the thick archival pages. Stephen watched him with a sudden flicker of nervous uncertainty crossing his pale face. I kept my eyes locked directly on my son as I recited the exact text of the clause from memory. I told Stephen that I had written that specific rule 30 years ago to protect my drivers and my warehouse workers from greedy investors. I explained that Section 4, Paragraph 9 was a strict morality and fiduciary breach clause. It explicitly stated that any executive officer or majority shareholder who committed a documented felony or engaged in verifiable financial theft against the corporate entity would immediately and irrevocably forfeit their entire equity stake back to the primary holding trust. Stephen let out a loud, forced laugh, trying to mask the pure terror suddenly flooding his system. He pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled that the clause was completely useless. He loudly claimed that he had not been convicted of any crime yet. He screamed that he was innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, and that I could not steal his shares based on a pending arson charge that had not even gone to trial. Sullivan reached into his briefcase a second time. He pulled out a stack of pristine white papers and dropped them onto the marble table right next to the founding charter. Sullivan looked at Stephen with absolute zero pity. He told my son that the attempted arson and the aggravated assault at the warehouse last night were certainly felonies, but they were not the triggering events. Sullivan spread the documents out so the slick defense lawyer could see them clearly. He pointed to the top page. It was the official bank record from the morning Stephen tried to drain the company accounts. It clearly showed the fraudulent power of attorney document, complete with my forged signature. Sullivan then pointed to the second page, which was a sworn affidavit from the bank manager Bruce, confirming that Stephen had attempted to initiate an unauthorized hostile wire transfer using falsified credentials. Sullivan looked directly at the defense attorney and explained the brutal legal reality. He stated that attempting to liquidate corporate capital using a forged legal document constituted immediate and undeniable fiduciary theft. It did not require a lengthy criminal conviction to trigger the corporate bylaws. The documented fraud at the bank was an absolute breach of fiduciary duty. I leaned forward, pressing my hands flat against the cold marble table. I told Stephen that his 40% equity stake did not exist anymore. I explained that I had legally enacted the dissolution of his shares 3 days ago. The exact moment I sat in the bank manager's office and put the entire company into a biometric blind trust. His shares had been instantly nullified and fully absorbed back into the primary holding company. He owned absolutely nothing. The defense lawyer stopped breathing. The polished, arrogant demeanor completely evaporated from his face. His eyes darted rapidly back and forth over the dense legal text of the founding charter and the undeniably damning bank records. He checked the notary stamps. He verified the dates on the federal tracking numbers. The crushing realization hit the slick lawyer like a physical blow to the chest. He slowly lifted his head and looked at Stephen. He did not look at him like a wealthy corporate client anymore. He looked at him like a broke, desperate liability who had just dragged him into a massive federal mess. The lawyer carefully closed the heavy leather charter and pushed it away from him. He turned to Stephen, and his voice was completely devoid of any previous warmth or professional courtesy. He asked Stephen exactly how he intended to pay the $500,000 legal retainer they had agreed upon outside the county jail this morning. Stephen began to stammer wildly, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He stepped toward the lawyer, frantically waving his hands. He swore that he would find the money somehow. He yelled that he still had the sprawling luxury mansion and that they could leverage the estate to cover the legal fees. I did not even blink as I shattered his final delusion. I reminded Stephen that the mansion was leased entirely under the corporate holding company. I informed him that I had executed a 24-hour eviction notice yesterday morning and that his wife Amanda was currently standing on the curb with all of their luxury furniture while the sheriff padlocked the front gates. I told him he had no house, no offshore accounts, no corporate buyout, and absolutely no money. The defense lawyer did not hesitate for a single second. He swiftly packed his legal demand letter back into his slim leather portfolio and snapped it shut with a loud, sharp click. He looked Stephen directly in the eye and stated that due to a gross misrepresentation of personal assets and an inability to secure the required retainer, their legal agreement was entirely void. He formally announced that he was withdrawing as his legal counsel effective immediately. Stephen reached out and tried to grab the lawyer's arm, begging him not to leave, but the lawyer shoved his hand away with utter disgust. The lawyer turned on his heel and walked briskly out of the executive boardroom without looking back even once. Stephen was left standing completely alone in the center of the massive room. The last remnants of his arrogant bravado fully drained from his body, leaving him hollow and trembling. He looked around the vast executive suite he used to control. He looked at Jim and Beverly, who were watching his downfall, with cold, silent judgment. They felt no sympathy for the man who had tried to destroy their livelihoods. Finally, Stephen looked at me. He looked at me with tears welling in his red, exhausted eyes, desperately hoping to find a soft, forgiving father, willing to save him from the abyss. He found only the hardened founder of a logistics empire protecting his people from a predator. The federal courthouse downtown was an intimidating structure built of thick gray granite and polished white marble. It was a cold and unforgiving building designed to make criminals feel incredibly small. I had spent the entire morning inside its walls working alongside Michael Sullivan to finalize the legal barricades around my logistics company. We had spent hours filing the necessary injunctions to ensure the corporate trust remained entirely impenetrable. The echoing sound of our footsteps mixed with the low, anxious murmur of lawyers and defendants, navigating the heavy consequences of their actions. I felt a profound sense of closure settling deep into my bones. The violent underground syndicate was permanently gone from my life. The corporate boardroom had been successfully purged of greedy executives. My lifetime of hard work was finally secure. But as Sullivan and I reached the sprawling ground floor of the courthouse, the loud and shrill sound of a very familiar voice shattered the quiet dignity of the building. It was Amanda. She was standing near the metal detectors at the main security entrance. She did not look like the immaculate socialite who used to host lavish garden parties at the luxury estate I had unknowingly paid for. Her hair was pulled back tightly into a messy knot, and she wore dark, oversized sunglasses indoors to hide her exhausted eyes. Standing a few feet away from her was my son Stephen. He looked completely hollowed out and physically broken. His posture was slumped, and his shoulders were hunched forward in defeat. He was wearing a cheap, wrinkled suit that hung loosely on his frame. His eyes darted around the massive lobby with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of a man who knew he was entirely out of options. He had just finished a preliminary bail hearing, and the crushing reality of a lengthy federal prison sentence was finally destroying his arrogant spirit. Amanda did not approach him with a comforting embrace or offer him any words of support. Instead, she motioned to a stranger standing next to her, who was holding a thick manila folder. The stranger stepped forward with cold, professional efficiency and pressed the heavy folder directly against Stephen's chest. Stephen grabbed the folder reflexively before it could fall to the marble floor. Amanda took a deliberate step back and loudly announced to the entire lobby that those were expedited divorce papers. She told him with absolute venom in her voice that she was legally severing all ties with him effective immediately. She stated that she was filing for sole protection of whatever minor assets she had left, and that she would not let him drag her down into a federal penitentiary. She was publicly washing her hands of the man she had conspired with for years. Stephen ripped the manila folder open and stared blankly at the legal documents. His pale face suddenly flushed with a violent and desperate rage. He threw the thick stack of papers onto the polished marble floor and stepped aggressively toward his wife. He yelled that she was a pathetic coward, abandoning ship. The exact second the money stopped flowing. He shouted that she had gladly spent millions of dollars of stolen corporate funds to build a fake luxury lifestyle. He reminded her loudly that he had drained his own safety nets just to keep her failing boutique afloat and to pay for her endless cosmetic procedures. Amanda screamed right back at him without a single ounce of hesitation. Her voice echoed sharply off the high vaulted ceilings, drawing the attention of every security guard and lawyer in the lobby. She blamed him for absolutely everything that had gone wrong in their lives. She yelled that he was a pathetic failure who had dragged her into a highly dangerous criminal underworld just to pay off his massive underground gambling debts. She called him a weak, incompetent fool who could not even manage to outsmart his own elderly father. They stood right there in the middle of the federal courthouse, tearing each other apart in front of dozens of watching strangers. There was no loyalty remaining between them. There was no love or mutual respect. They were just two desperate parasites fighting viciously over the scraps of a host they had completely destroyed. Michael Sullivan and I walked directly toward the main exit. Our path took us right past their vicious public meltdown. Stephen saw me approaching from the corner of his eye, and his face completely crumpled. All of his previous rage instantly dissolved into pure, pathetic panic. He reached his shaking hand out toward me, and his voice cracked as he begged me to intervene. He pleaded with me to talk some sense into his wife and to help him fix the massive financial mess he was drowning in. He called me Dad and asked me to save him one last time. Amanda also turned to me the moment she saw me walking by. She immediately attempted to play the role of the innocent, manipulated victim. She pulled off her dark sunglasses to show her tear-filled eyes. She swore to me that she had absolutely no idea how deep Stephen had gone into the criminal syndicate. She begged me to believe that she was just a supportive wife who had been lied to and forced into participating in the financial fraud. I did not stop walking. I did not slow my pace for a single second. I did not offer them a single word of anger or sympathy. I did not even offer them the basic courtesy of an acknowledgement. I looked right through them as if they were nothing more than invisible ghosts haunting a building I was simply leaving behind. I had spent 4 decades enabling my son and trying to fix his mistakes. I had spent years treating Amanda like a daughter. But in that moment, I felt absolutely nothing for them. Their toxicity could no longer touch me. The silence I gave them was much heavier and far more devastating than any lecture or insult I could have delivered. I pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors and stepped out into the bright, warm afternoon sunlight, leaving them trapped in their own self-made prison. Amanda let out a loud, triumphant sigh behind me. She had officially served her husband and publicly washed her hands of his crimes. She truly believed she had successfully manipulated the narrative. She pushed through the revolving doors right after me, adjusting her designer purse and preparing to disappear into the bustling city to start her life over. But she did not make it more than 3 steps down the concrete stairs. 2 men and 1 woman wearing dark, unassuming suits stepped directly out of a black vehicle parked at the curb. They moved with absolute tactical precision, blocking Amanda's path to the sidewalk. The lead federal agent did not raise his voice or show any emotion. He calmly asked Amanda to confirm her identity. When she stammered a quiet yes, the agent pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He informed her that she was under federal arrest. He listed her charges clearly and methodically, stating she was being indicted for wire fraud, conspiracy to commit corporate theft, and direct involvement in the forgery of a legal power of attorney document. Amanda let out a gut-wrenching scream of pure, absolute panic as the federal agents quickly secured her wrists behind her back. She thrashed against their grip, sobbing wildly and screaming that it was all a mistake. The heavy steel cuffs clicked shut with a sharp final sound, completely shattering her delusion that she could walk away from the destruction she had helped create. Sullivan and I stood on the sidewalk and watched in silence as the agents placed her into the back of the dark vehicle. The car drove away, blending seamlessly into the city traffic and taking the last piece of the betrayal away with it. The morning air was cool and smelled of damp pine needles. I sat on my wooden front porch holding a chipped ceramic mug filled with cheap, dark roast coffee. For the first time in weeks, my phone was not ringing. There were no frantic text messages from my son. There were no urgent updates from my corporate lawyers. The sprawling chaos of the federal courthouse and the bitter betrayal inside the boardroom felt like they belonged to another lifetime. Sitting in the rusted metal folding chair right next to me was my daughter Rachel. She blew gently on her own mug of coffee, watching the neighborhood slowly wake up. 4 years had separated Rachel and me, but the distance between us no longer felt like an open wound. The night she returned, she had forced me to face truths I had spent years avoiding. I had admitted that my silence had protected Stephen instead of correcting him, and she had made it clear that forgiveness would not erase the damage overnight. Since then, we had stopped speaking, like 2 people defending opposite sides of an old family argument. We spoke carefully, honestly, and without pretending that money could repair what neglect had broken. Rachel did not flatter me or soften her opinions to protect my pride. When she believed I was wrong, she told me directly. For the first time in years, I listened without trying to explain myself. That morning, sitting beside her on the porch, I understood that our reconciliation was not built on sentimentality. It was built on accountability. I could not recover the 4 years we had lost, but I could decide what kind of father I would be from that moment forward. The company still needed a permanent future, and I believed I finally knew who possessed the judgment and integrity to protect it. I set my coffee mug down on the small wooden table between us. I reached into my canvas jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope secured with a string tie. I slid it across the table toward her. She looked at the envelope and then looked up at me with her brow furrowed in quiet suspicion. I told her that the paperwork inside transferred total executive control of the logistics empire directly into her name. I explained that with Stephen going to federal prison and Amanda facing severe wire fraud charges, the company needed a new permanent director. I told her that she was the only family I had left to trust with $100 million legacy. Rachel did not reach for the envelope. She did not even break eye contact with me. She took another slow sip of her coffee and gently pushed the heavy envelope back across the wooden table. She told me she did not want it. She explained that she had spent the last 5 years building a non-profit organization from the ground up, providing housing and job training for single mothers. She said she had fought tooth and nail to secure federal grants and local funding without anyone knowing her last name. She was incredibly proud of what she had built with her own 2 hands, far away from the dark shadow of my wealth. The rejection stung slightly, but it was not born of malice or anger. I leaned forward, and my voice was thick with decades of unsaid apologies. I told her I wanted to make things right between us. I wanted to give her the empire she actually deserved and hand her the keys to a kingdom her brother had so violently taken for granted. Rachel reached out and placed her hand gently over mine. The calluses on my fingers felt incredibly rough against her skin. She smiled a soft, genuine smile that reminded me so much of her late mother, Barbara. She told me she did not need a massive logistics fleet or an unlimited corporate bank account to feel loved. She said she had watched money completely destroy her brother and corrupt her sister-in-law. She did not want that poison anywhere near her life or her non-profit work. She told me she just wanted her father back. She wanted the man who used to read to her on the porch before he let guilt and grief blind him to the truth. Her words settled over me like a heavy, comforting blanket. I realized in that exact moment that trying to hand her the company was just another version of the exact same mistake I had made with Stephen. I was trying to use money and corporate power to substitute for genuine parental presence. Rachel did not want my money because her character was already completely whole without it. She had survived the toxicity of our family by walking away and building her own absolute independence. I pulled the thick envelope back across the table and tucked it safely inside my jacket pocket. The morning sun broke through the tree line, warming the wooden planks of the porch. I had my daughter back, and that was worth more than every single dollar sitting inside my secure blind trust. We sat in silence for a long time, just listening to the distant hum of the highway traffic and enjoying the absolute peace of a relationship completely free of financial expectations. But a massive, daunting problem still loomed heavily over my head. My logistics company generated tens of millions of dollars in revenue every single year. It employed 300 hardworking men and women who relied on me to keep a roof over their heads and food on their tables. With Stephen heading to a federal penitentiary and Rachel firmly refusing to inherit the corporate throne, the empire had absolutely no clear successor. I could not run the warehouse floors forever. My bones were tired and my time as a chief executive was rapidly coming to a close. I also knew I could not simply sell the company to a massive private equity firm. I had seen what those corporate vultures did to regional businesses. They would strip the company for parts, liquidate the delivery trucks, and fire the loyal workers who had actually built the foundation. I had to figure out what to do with a $100 million machine to ensure that absolute suffocating greed could never corrupt its foundation again. I needed a permanent radical solution that would protect the working-class people I cared about while permanently locking out the predators. The federal courtroom felt entirely different from the bustling, chaotic lobby where Amanda had been arrested just weeks prior. This room was a heavy, silent sanctuary, built of dark mahogany wood and deep blue carpet. It was a room designed specifically for the final and absolute delivery of consequences. I sat in the second row of the wooden gallery benches with my attorney Michael Sullivan sitting quietly beside me. We were not there to fight a legal battle anymore. The battle was already over. We were simply there to witness the inevitable conclusion. The heavy wooden door next to the judge's bench slowly opened, and a federal bailiff escorted my son into the courtroom. Stephen did not look like the arrogant corporate executive who had tried to steal a $100 million logistics empire. He did not look like a man who drove imported sports cars or lived in a sprawling, gated mansion. He looked incredibly small. He was wearing a standard-issue loose-fitting khaki uniform. His wrists were secured in heavy steel handcuffs that were attached to a thick chain wrapped tightly around his waist. His feet shuffled awkwardly as he walked because of the heavy chains binding his ankles together. I looked at his face and felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. His cheeks were hollow, and his skin was a pale, sickly gray. The county holding cell had completely stripped away his false bravado and left behind a terrified, desperate shell of a man. Sullivan leaned slightly toward me and whispered the details of the agreement. He explained that the federal prosecutors had compiled an insurmountable mountain of evidence. They had the physical ledgers detailing the money laundering for the underground syndicate. They had the security footage from the warehouse attempted arson. They had the bank records proving the forged power of attorney. Sullivan told me that if Stephen had chosen to take the case to a jury trial, he would have faced a mandatory minimum of 25 years in a federal penitentiary. The public defender assigned to his case had advised him to surrender. Stephen had agreed to sign a formal plea deal accepting a guaranteed sentence of 7 years in federal prison to avoid spending the rest of his natural life behind bars. The federal judge entered the courtroom and took her seat at the elevated bench. She was a stern, older woman with sharp eyes who did not tolerate any nonsense in her courtroom. She opened a thick legal file and looked down at my son. She read the specific charges aloud one by one. She read the charges for wire fraud. She read the charges for corporate embezzlement. She read the charges for conspiracy to commit money laundering. After every single charge, she paused and asked Stephen how he pleaded. Stephen had to lean forward toward the microphone resting on the defense table. His voice was incredibly weak and shaky. He whispered the word guilty over and over again. Every time he said it, another layer of his lifelong delusion was completely peeled away. I was forced to publicly admit in front of a federal judge and a court stenographer that he was not a successful businessman. He was forced to admit that he was a common thief. When the formal reading of the plea agreement was finished, the judge closed the file. She looked at Stephen and asked him if he had any final words before she officially handed down the 7-year federal sentence. Stephen did not look at the judge. He slowly turned around, awkwardly shuffling his chained feet until he was facing the gallery. He looked directly at me. His eyes were completely red and overflowing with genuine, desperate tears. He was not faking his emotions. The absolute reality of spending the next 7 years locked inside a concrete cell had finally broken his mind. He began to cry openly right there in the middle of the federal courtroom. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice cracking loudly. "Please, you have to help me. I cannot go to a federal prison. I will not survive in there. You know I will not survive." I was sobbing heavily now, pulling frantically against the steel chains binding his wrists. He asked me to hire a better lawyer. He begged me to spend my millions to find a legal fixer who could somehow undo the plea agreement. He brought up my late wife, Barbara, crying and swearing that his mother would never have allowed this to happen to her only son. He begged me to walk up to the judge and tell her that it was all a terrible family misunderstanding. He wanted me to save him one last time. The federal bailiff took a step forward, ready to physically restrain Stephen, but the judge raised her hand to stop him. She looked out at the gallery and locked eyes with me. She asked me if I wished to make a formal victim impact statement before the court adjourned. Michael Sullivan gave me a single, silent nod. I slowly stood up from the hard wooden bench. I buttoned my canvas jacket and walked down the center aisle. I passed the defense table and stepped up to the wooden podium facing the judge's bench. I adjusted the small black microphone. The entire courtroom was completely silent. The only sound was the muffled, pathetic sobbing coming from my son. I did not feel a single ounce of rage. I did not feel the need to yell or scream or seek any kind of public revenge. I just felt a deep, overwhelming sense of clarity. I looked at the judge and thanked her for her time. Then I turned slightly to my right and looked directly into my son's tear-filled eyes. I told Stephen that for his entire life, I had treated him like a fragile glass object that needed to be protected from the harsh reality of the world. I told him that when he crashed his first car, I quietly bought him a new one. I told him that when he failed his college classes, I paid for expensive private tutors to fix his grades. I explained that I had spent 40 years using my wealth and my influence to sweep every single one of his mistakes neatly under the rug. I kept my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of emotion. I told him that I realized my blind, unconditional protection did not make him a better man. It only made him weak, arrogant, and incredibly dangerous. I told him that my money had turned him into a predator who thought he could steal from his own family and launder money for violent criminals without ever facing a single consequence. Stephen stared at me, his mouth trembling as tears streamed down his pale cheeks. He shook his head slowly, silently begging me to stop talking and save him. I gripped the edges of the wooden podium. I told him that I loved him very much, but loving a child does not mean shielding a criminal from the law. I told him I could not fix this for him, because fixing it would be the cruelest thing I could possibly do to him. You are a grown man. I stated, my voice carrying through the silent courtroom with absolute heavy finality. These are the consequences of your choices. I let go of the podium and turned my back to him. I did not look at him again. I walked back down the center aisle and took my seat next to Michael Sullivan. The judge nodded her head in solemn agreement. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel and struck the sounding block with a loud, sharp crack. She formally sentenced Stephen Bennett to serve 84 months in a federal penitentiary facility, followed by 5 years of supervised release, and ordered him to pay full financial restitution to the corporate holding trust. The bailiff immediately stepped forward and grasped Stephen firmly by the arm. Stephen let out a loud, broken wail of absolute despair as the bailiff pulled him away from the defense table. The heavy chains clanked loudly against the floor as he was forced to shuffle toward the side exit. The heavy wooden door opened, and he was led away into the dark holding corridor. The door swung shut behind him with a deep, echoing thud that resonated in my chest. I sat quietly in the wooden pew and took a deep, steady breath. The absolute worst chapter of my life was officially closed. I felt a distinct physical sensation deep inside my heart. The final heavy thread of my blind parental enabling was permanently cut. I was finally completely free. 1 year has passed since the heavy wooden doors of the federal courtroom closed on my son. Time has a funny way of smoothing out the jagged edges of a broken heart. It is 6:30 in the morning. The air is crisp with the promise of early autumn. I pull my old rusted pickup truck into the exact same drive-through lane of the local coffee shop. The young barista greets me with a bright, familiar smile. She hands me a large, dark roast drip coffee. The total is $3.38. I hand her my plastic bank card. There is no anxiety tightening in my chest today. There is no looming threat of a frozen account or a hostile financial takeover. The card reader chimes with a bright, cheerful sound. The transaction is approved instantly. I drop a crisp $20 bill into her tip jar and tell her to have a wonderful morning. I put the truck in drive and pull out onto the open highway. The financial bloodline is no longer a weapon used to control my life. It is simply a tool, and I am the only one holding the key. I drive down the interstate, heading toward the main logistics headquarters. The massive warehouse complex looms in the distance, but it no longer feels like a heavy burden on my tired shoulders. When my son went to prison, and my daughter firmly declined the corporate throne, I was faced with $100 million dilemma. I could not run the operations forever, and I absolutely refused to sell my legacy to a private equity firm. Those corporate vultures would have stripped the assets, liquidated the delivery trucks, and fired the loyal workers who actually built the foundation. So I chose a completely different path. I spent 6 months working with Michael Sullivan and a team of corporate restructuring experts. We did not sell the empire. We transitioned the entire logistics network into an employee-owned cooperative. I park my truck in the front lot and walk through the heavy glass doors. The atmosphere inside the building is completely transformed. The arrogant vice presidents and the corporate sycophants are long gone. The people running the operations are the men and women who actually know the value of hard work. Jim oversees the entire regional supply chain from the main executive office. Beverly manages the corporate payroll and the cooperative profit-sharing distributions. Every single driver, warehouse worker, and office clerk now owns a tangible equity stake in the company when the delivery trucks run on time and the freight contracts are fulfilled. The workers see the direct financial benefit in their own personal bank accounts. Morale has never been higher, and our regional profits have steadily increased. I no longer sit at the head of the massive Italian marble boardroom table. I handed over my chief executive title months ago. I simply act as a senior advisor sitting in a modest corner office a few days a week to offer guidance when asked. I walk the warehouse floor today and listen to the roaring engines of the freight trucks. I watch Jim and Beverly navigate complex vendor negotiations with absolute integrity. I see the pride in the eyes of the forklift operators who know they are building a secure future for their own children, not financing the luxury mansions of a greedy heir. I even partnered with my daughter Rachel to create a new initiative. The cooperative now diverts a dedicated percentage of our quarterly profits directly into her nonprofit organization to build housing for single mothers. She brings her passion to the community, and I provide the quiet financial engine to make it happen. We have breakfast together every Sunday morning. We do not talk about money or corporate shares. We talk about life. I created a financial fortress that can never be bought out or corrupted by outside predators ever again. By early afternoon, I leave the headquarters and return to my quiet suburban neighborhood. The sprawling chaos of slick lawyers, federal agents, and bitter public divorces is completely eradicated from my daily routine. I unlock the front door of the modest 3-bedroom house I bought 30 years ago. The house is perfectly quiet, but it does not feel empty or lonely. It feels incredibly peaceful. I walk into the kitchen and sit down at the old wooden table. The surface is scratched and worn from decades of family dinners and late-night planning. I pour myself a fresh cup of coffee and look across the room. Resting on the counter is a silver-framed photograph of my late wife, Barbara. She is smiling brightly in the picture, standing proudly in front of my very first delivery truck. I look at her beautiful smile, and I do not feel any lingering sorrow. I do not feel a single ounce of vengeance toward the son sitting in a federal penitentiary or the daughter-in-law facing her own criminal trials. Vengeance requires carrying a heavy, dark weight inside your soul, and I refuse to carry their toxicity for another second. They are living the exact lives they earned through their own deceit and manipulation. I am living the life I protected through absolute truth and unwavering resolve. I take a slow, deep breath of the quiet afternoon air. I spent 40 years believing that true wealth was measured by the size of a corporate bank account or the number of freight trucks parked in a massive shipping yard. I thought leaving a massive financial inheritance behind was the ultimate mark of a successful father. I was completely wrong. The events of the past year stripped away every single illusion I ever had about money and power. Looking at Barbara's photograph, I finally understand the pure reality of what we actually built. True wealth is not something you can hoard in an offshore bank account. It is not something a greedy child can steal with a forged signature or a desperate lie. True wealth is the absolute unshakable dignity you maintain when arrogant people try to strip your humanity away. It is the quiet power of standing your ground, protecting the hardworking people who actually depend on you, and refusing to let darkness corrupt your foundation. I am George Bennett. I am 71 years old today, and as I sit in my quiet kitchen sipping my dark roast coffee, I have never been a richer man.